The moment I saw her, I thought she was the kind of person I'd been waiting for. She walked into the bar like she already belonged there, her head high and her hair spilling over her shoulders. I'd nearly cancelled the date. I wasn't sure about online dating, hadn't done it much, but something about her profile had drawn me in. She looked different in person, better somehow, more alive. We hit it off straight away. Drinks turned into dinner and I didn't even notice the hours passing. She laughed at my jokes, leaned in when I spoke, and I found myself talking more than I usually do. She was easy to be around, like someone I'd known for years. When we said goodbye outside the bar, she hugged me for a moment longer than I expected, her perfume sharp and floral, and then she was gone. I went to bed that night thinking maybe things had finally clicked. Maybe I'd finally met someone who understood me, who wanted the same things. I didn't expect to wake up the next morning to the smell of food. For a second, I thought I was dreaming. And then I heard movement in the kitchen, clattering dishes, the scrape of a chair being pulled out. My heart slammed in my chest as I got up and crept to the door. She was there, standing by the stove, flipping pancakes like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her coat was draped over the back of a chair, her bag on the floor beside it. She noticed me and smiled, holding up a plate. I didn't know what to say. I stood there for what felt like ages before I grabbed my phone and texted a friend to come over. I didn't want to be alone with her. She left before my friend arrived, saying something about seeing me soon. I didn't respond. I spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of it. Had I forgotten giving her my keys? Had I left the door unlocked? I changed the locks that evening, just in case. I thought that was the end of it. I thought maybe she'd got the hint. The next morning, she was outside my building, just standing there, looking up at my window. When I left for work, she was still there, leaning against a lamppost, a takeaway coffee cup in her hand. She didn't follow me, but when I got to work, there was a message from her. She said she hoped I'd had a good day. It went on like that for a while. I'd see her outside my building or across the street from the coffee shop I went to. Once, she was in the supermarket while I was doing my weekly shop, walking down the same aisles I did, her basket almost empty. She didn't speak to me, just stayed close enough that I couldn't ignore her. One night I came home to find a small box on my doorstep. Inside was a photo of us from our date, framed in silver. There was no note, no explanation, just the photo, the two of us smiling like we'd known each other forever. I blocked her number, but the messages kept coming from different ones. She started sending flowers to my office, bouquets so big they took up half my desk. My colleagues joked about it, but I could see the way they looked at me, the questions they didn't ask. The worst was when I found her inside my flat again. I don't know how she got in. I came home from work and there she was, sitting on my sofa with a mug of tea, flipping through a magazine she'd taken from my coffee table. She looked up when I walked in and smiled like she'd been waiting for me. I didn't confront her. I just backed out and left. I spent the night in my car, parked 2 streets over, watching the window of my flat. Around midnight, the light in the living room went out, and a few minutes later I saw her leave. She was carrying something under her arm, but I couldn't tell what it was. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That we'd been on one date and now she wouldn't leave me alone? That she'd somehow managed to get into my locked flat twice? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. I started staying at a friend's place, avoiding my flat as much as I could. When I did go back, it always felt like she'd been there. Things would be moved, a chair out of place, a cupboard left open. Once I found my wardrobe door hanging ajar, clothes pulled halfway out onto the floor. I tried to ignore it, to act like it didn't bother me, but it was getting harder. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was always nearby, just out of sight. Last night I woke up in the middle of the night and looked out the window of my friend's flat. She was there, standing on the pavement across the street, her head tilted slightly, her hands hanging at her sides. She didn't move. I don't know how she found me. I don't know what she wants. I just know she isn't going to stop. She told me she lived alone. She didn't mean anything by it. It just slipped out, part of some story she was telling about her dog from years ago, how he used to bark at anyone who came too close to the front gate. But it stayed with me, that detail. Lives alone. It lingered in the back of my head as she talked about her job, her friends, the way she laughed at things I said that weren't all that funny. She wasn't trying too hard, though. That was nice. Some people try too hard. Dinner went well enough. She smiled a lot. I liked that. There was something unguarded about it, like she wasn't used to hiding her emotions. I could tell she wasn't sure about me by the end of it. She hesitated when I offered to take her home, but She didn't say no. Her place wasn't far, and as I drove, I glanced at her now and then. She was looking out the window, her hand resting on the door handle like she wanted to leave. When we got to her street, she pointed out the house. It was small, 2 stories, with a porch that had peeling paint. The kind of place where no one would notice much if something happened. The porch light was out and the garden was overgrown. She said goodnight and went inside without looking back. I parked around the corner, down the street where the trees were thicker, and waited. Her curtains were drawn, but the light in the living room stayed on for a while. I imagined her taking off her shoes, throwing her bag on the sofa. She'd probably sit there for a bit, scrolling through her phone, replaying the date in her head, deciding whether I was worth a second one. I stayed until the light went off. I wasn't planning to do anything, not really. I just wanted to see. The next day I thought about her constantly. I wondered if she thought about me. I drove by her house after work just to check. Her car was in the driveway. I could almost picture her sitting at the kitchen table, maybe eating dinner, maybe watching something on her laptop. I circled back later after the sun had gone down. The house looked the same, quiet and unremarkable, but something about it felt different at night, like it had been cut off from the rest of the neighborhood. The streetlights didn't quite reach the front door, and the trees seemed closer than they had during the day. I parked further down this time and walked to the house. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I thought I'd see her through a window, catch a glimpse of her brushing her hair or reading in bed. I just wanted to see her. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. I stood there for a moment, listening to the night. The door wasn't locked. I was only going to look, just a quick glance, nothing more. Her kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, the kind that sits in the pot too long and burns at the edges. There was a mug in the sink, a jacket slung over the back of a chair. I didn't touch anything, didn't move anything. I just stood there, breathing in the space she lived in. Then there was a sound upstairs. It startled me more than it should have. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a second I thought about leaving, but instead I moved to the staircase. The steps groaned beneath my feet as I climbed, the air growing warmer the higher I went. Her bedroom door was ajar, the light spilling out in a thin sliver. When I pushed it open, she was lying in bed, her face turned towards the wall. Her hair fanned out over the pillow and the duvet was pulled up to her shoulders. I stood there for what felt like forever, just looking at her. She shifted slightly and I backed away, careful not to make a sound. In the kitchen, I knocked a glass off the counter. It hit the floor with a crash that shattered the quiet. Upstairs, I heard her stir, the bed creaking as she moved. I thought about running, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. I picked up a dish towel and knelt to gather the shards of glass. My hands were shaking. Her footsteps came down the stairs, slow and tentative, and then she was there, standing in the doorway. Her eyes widened when she saw me. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I raised my hands, holding the dish towel like it explained anything. She stepped back, her hand fumbling for something behind her, a phone, maybe. I don't remember what I said, but I must have said something. She turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the floor. I moved without thinking, grabbing her wrist as she reached for the front door. She struggled, her breathing ragged and uneven, her skin clammy under my grip. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to listen. The next few moments were a blur. She twisted free, grabbing a set of keys from the table by the door. Before I could react, she slammed the keys into my arm, the jagged edge biting into my skin. The pain made me let go, and she bolted out the door, sprinting into the night. I stood there, blood dripping down my arm, my heart racing. I should have left, but I couldn't move. Her house was quiet again, the kitchen light flickering slightly. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I walked out the door and into the street. Her car was still in the driveway. I've been back to the house since, but she's never there. The curtains stay drawn and the garden grows wilder by the day. The neighborhood feels different now, like it's holding its breath. Sometimes I think I see her, in a shop or on a busy street, always at the edge of my vision. But when I turn, it's never her, just someone who looks like her. The door was painted a pale green. It didn't match the rest of the house, which was grey with white trim, like something you'd see in a small-town postcard. The house sat back from the street, half hidden by a line of thin, crooked trees. It wasn't much to look at, but I'd been staring at that door all evening, waiting for her to open it. When she finally did, she smiled. Her smile wasn't too big, not the kind that made you feel like someone was trying too hard, just soft and easy, like she was happy to see me. She leaned against the doorframe as she said goodbye, her hair tucked behind one ear, and I could see the faint glow of a lamp spilling out from the living room behind her. I didn't rush. I let the moment stretch, taking my time as I stepped back onto the porch, letting her think I didn't want to leave. That kind of hesitation always made people feel safer, like you weren't in a hurry to disappear. I turned when I reached the pavement, giving her one last wave. She waved back, then closed the door. The soft click of the lock was barely audible, but I caught it. The street was quiet as I walked to my car, parked a little further down where the trees made it hard to see from her house. I didn't drive away, not yet. Instead, I killed the engine and waited. The porch light stayed on for a while, long enough for her to move through the house, maybe tidy up or check her phone. Then it went dark. The window on the second floor lit up next, the glow faint but enough to tell me which room she was in. I let another 10 minutes pass before I stepped out of the car, my breath fogging the air as I walked back toward her house. The latch on her kitchen window was loose. I had noticed it when she was pouring drinks, the way the frame didn't quite sit flush. The conversation had drifted somewhere else, but I'd kept my eyes on it, testing it with a casual press of my hand when she wasn't looking. I moved around the side of the house now, the ground soft under my shoes, and slipped between the narrow gap of the trees that lined her fence. It wasn't locked. People in houses like this never locked their garden gates. They always thought they were safe. The kitchen window slid open quietly, the frame stuttering just slightly as it met resistance. I took my time easing it up, pausing every few inches to listen. There was no movement, no sound except the faint hum of the fridge as I stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender, maybe from a candle she'd burned earlier. The living room was just off to the right, her shoes kicked off near the sofa. One of them had fallen on its side, its laces splayed out across the carpet. I moved carefully through the house, keeping to the edges of the floor where it wouldn't creak. The staircase was narrow, and the carpet muffled my footsteps as I made my way up. The door to her bedroom was half open, and I could see the outline of her body under the duvet, her breathing steady and shallow. I stood there for a long time, just watching. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a street lamp outside the window. Her phone was on the nightstand, the screen face down. The camera in my hand felt solid and cold, its surface slightly slick from the sweat on my palms. I didn't bring it out often, not unless it felt right. This did. The sound it made when I pressed the button was soft, but unmistakable. The flash illuminated the room for a fraction of a second, bright enough to make her stir. I froze. She shifted under the duvet, her breathing hitching as she turned her head. I stayed perfectly still, my body pressed against the wall, the camera tucked into my jacket. For a moment I thought she was going to sit up, but then she settled back, her breathing slowing again. The space under the bed was cramped, but it was better than standing in the open. I slid under quickly, keeping one hand on the frame to steady myself. The floor was cool against my chest, dust gathering in the corners where her vacuum couldn't reach. She stayed awake for a while, her movements small but restless. I could hear the sheets rustling above me, her breathing uneven as she turned onto her side. It felt like hours before she finally stilled, the rhythm of her breathing deepening. The camera was still in my hand, its strap wrapped tightly around my wrist. I didn't need another photo. One was enough. The image was already burned into my mind, the sudden flash illuminating her wide eyes, her lips slightly parted in sleep. I didn't move. I couldn't risk it. The space under the bed felt smaller the longer I stayed there, the air growing warmer with each passing second. Somewhere downstairs a clock chimed faintly, marking the hour. Her breathing changed. I didn't look up. I didn't dare, but I could feel it, the shift in the room above me, the faint creak of the mattress as her weight shifted. I tightened my grip on the camera, my body pressed as flat as possible against the floor. I turned the flash off the camera, crawled out from under the bed. She was fast asleep, and I was ready to take more pictures. It all began with a swipe. That's how things go these days, isn't it? A photo, a bio, a quick chat. Her name was Amy. She was smiling in all her pictures, wide, toothy, like she knew something you didn't. She seemed normal enough. Her profile said she worked in marketing, loved hiking, had a cat named Penny. We chatted for a few days, nothing deep, just the usual small talk, and eventually agreed to meet for coffee. It felt low pressure. Casual, it didn't seem like a big deal. The date wasn't bad, not exactly, just awkward, forced. She was nervous, fidgety, talking too much and too fast about things that didn't really matter. Every time I tried to steer the conversation somewhere lighter, she'd drag it back to her exes or her strained relationship with her mum, that kind of thing. I nodded along, trying to be polite, but it was obvious there wasn't any chemistry. Not for me, anyway. We finished our drinks, exchanged polite goodbyes, and I left, assuming that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The text came first. A simple "thank you for the coffee" the night of the date, which was fine, perfectly normal. But then a few hours later, another message about how much she'd enjoyed herself, followed by one saying she thought we had something special. By the next morning, there were 6 unread messages, all saying variations of the same thing. I didn't respond to any of them. I figured she'd get the hint. 2 days later, my car was keyed. It was parked outside my building, the driver's side scratched deep and jagged, the way you do it if you were angry. I didn't have proof it was her, but who else would it be? The timing was too coincidental. That night, the calls started. They came in bursts, 5 or 6 within a few minutes, then nothing for hours, then another cluster out of nowhere. I didn't answer any of them. The voicemail box filled up quickly. I didn't listen to the messages, but seeing the notifications pile up on my screen made my stomach churn. By the end of the week, the calls and texts had slowed, but they hadn't stopped. I blocked her number. It was the only thing I could think to do. It helped for a while, but the quiet didn't last. One night, I got home from work to find a note taped to my door. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. It was scrawled in frantic, looping handwriting, full of phrases like "meant to be" and "you'll see it eventually." I tore it down, crumpled it up, and threw it in the bin. Then I double-checked the locks on the door and windows. That's when I started to notice other things. My rubbish bin, which had been left untouched on the curb, tipped over and spilled across the street. A knock at my door late at night, but no one there when I checked. A shadow. A figure, maybe, standing across the street under the street lamp, gone when I looked again. It was paranoia that my imagination was running away with me. But it didn't feel like paranoia. The final straw came 3 weeks after the date. It was a Saturday night. I had been out with some friends and came home late, tired, a little drunk, ready to collapse into bed. My flat was dark when I got in, just as I'd left it. But something was off. The air felt different, like someone had been there while I was gone. I found her in my bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of my bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was messy, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the wall in front of her. She didn't move when I stepped into the room. She just sat there breathing quietly, like she belonged there. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn around and walk out the door, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at her. My brain was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to figure out how she'd gotten in. Her bag was on the floor beside her, unzipped. Inside, I saw photos of me. Photos I didn't remember being taken. Some of them were from that night, the night I'd been out with friends. Others were older, candid shots of me at work, walking to my car, coming out of my building. Beneath the photos was a small kitchen knife, its blade gleaming faintly in the light from the hallway. I backed out of the room, moving as quietly as I could. She didn't follow me. She didn't even look up. I made it to the door and ran. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, panting and shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. I called the police from a payphone at the corner. When they arrived, she was gone. There was no sign she'd been there at all, except for the photos and the knife, still lying on my bedroom floor. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. The locks have been changed, cameras installed, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting for her next move. It's strange how things can circle back around, how lives can reconnect after so much time has passed. A name pops up on a screen, a face from years ago, and something stirs. That's how it was with her. A random friend request on social media, her profile picture soft and smiling, like she hadn't aged a day since high school. She looked happy. I accepted it without a second thought. What else would I have done? We exchanged a few messages, harmless things, old memories, inside jokes from back then, that sort of thing. She mentioned she was still in town, working at a small bakery near the edge of the city. It seemed like fate. I wasn't far away myself. I hadn't really been far from anything for years. The first time we met up, I could hardly believe how little had changed. She still had that laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. It was like stepping into the past. She was easy to talk to, as she'd always been, and the conversation flowed naturally. She spoke about her life, her job, and her family, and I soaked it all in, every word and detail. She didn't ask much about me, and that was fine. I didn't have much to share anyway. The meetups became a regular thing, though I'm not sure she realized that was how I saw them. To her, I think they were casual. A quick coffee here, a chance encounter at the grocery store there. I started finding ways to cross paths with her. It wasn't difficult. People are creatures of habit. I made note of the days she worked, the times she left her flat. I wasn't stalking her, not really. I just wanted to be near her, to be part of her life again. I began taking small souvenirs, a napkin she left on the table, a hair tie she dropped once, little things she wouldn't miss. They made me feel connected to her, like I had a piece of her to hold on to. It became a sort of ritual, these small collections. They piled up in a corner of my apartment, and I built a space for them, arranging them carefully like they were sacred. Her old photos from high school went there too, along with a few new ones I'd taken from a distance. She looked good in all of them. One day, I stopped by the bakery where she worked. She hadn't mentioned me coming, but I figured it would be a nice surprise. She seemed a little off balance when she saw me, like she hadn't been expecting me to show up. I stayed for a coffee, sitting at a table in the corner while she moved behind the counter. I liked watching her work, seeing how she interacted with the customers. She had this way of tilting her head when she listened, this little smile that made people feel at ease. She always made me feel at ease. After that, I started showing up more often, once or twice a week, always timing it so I'd catch her shift. She didn't always come out to say hello, but that didn't matter. It was enough just to see her to know she was there. Sometimes I'd follow her home after work, keeping a careful distance. She never noticed. She was always distracted, lost in her own world. The shrine grew. I added receipts from the bakery, little bits of ribbon she'd used to tie up pastry boxes. I found her address online and wrote it down on a slip of paper, folding it neatly and tucking it into the corner of the shrine. It felt like a piece of her life was becoming part of mine, weaving together in a way that was meant to be. One night I drove by her flat and noticed the lights were on. I parked across the street and stayed there for hours, watching her silhouette move through the curtains. She was cooking, or maybe cleaning. I couldn't tell from the distance. I imagined what it would be like to be there with her, to share that space, to build a life together like we should have all those years ago. It wasn't fair that we'd been apart for so long. It wasn't fair that she didn't see it the way I did. I started leaving little gifts for her, a flower on her doorstep, a handwritten note slipped under her door, nothing threatening, nothing that would scare her, just things to show her I cared. I wanted her to know she wasn't alone, that someone was looking out for her. She didn't mention them in our meetups, but I knew she'd seen them. She must have. The night I found her flat unlocked, I took it as a sign. It wasn't like I planned to go inside, but the door was there, slightly ajar, inviting me in. Her scent was everywhere, soft and familiar. The flat was small but cozy, filled with little touches that made it hers. A stack of books on the coffee table, a pair of trainers kicked off by the door. I wandered through the rooms, taking it all in, careful not to disturb anything. Her bedroom was the last place I went. It felt intimate stepping into that space, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I stood there for a long time, looking at the bed where she slept, the photos on the nightstand. One of them was of us from high school. I hadn't seen it in years. I didn't even know she still had it. I don't know how long I stayed. Long enough to feel like I belonged there, like I was part of her life again, even if she didn't realize it yet. When I left, I made sure everything was exactly as I'd found it. She wouldn't know I'd been there, not yet.